The fluorescent lights hummed overhead as Sarah Chen moved through Sacred Heart Hospital's night corridors like a ghost nobody had learned to see yet. Her scrubs were navy blue, faded from 100 washings, and her name tag read simply Test Chen, RN, in letters so worn they were almost illegible. It was 2,206 hours, 10:06 p.m. in civilian time, and she still thought in military hours without meaning to. The antiseptic smell wrapped around her like a familiar coat, masking everything underneath. Down the third-floor hallway, past the nurse's station where the younger staff didn't make eye contact, her hands moved with the kind of muscle memory that came from somewhere else entirely, somewhere she didn't talk about anymore. She had been moving like this for 4 years. Invisible. Competent. Silent. The medical discharge papers from Bagram Medical Center were 7 years old now, signed in 2017 after the incident at Sangin. That was the official word they used in reports, incident. What it actually meant was that Major Sarah Chen, then serving as a forward surgical team medic with the 24th Special Tactics Squadron, had disobeyed a direct order from her commanding officer, Colonel Marcus Vance, to maintain a defensive perimeter. 3 wounded Marines were bleeding out 200 meters beyond the safe zone, and she'd walked out anyway with nothing but a trauma kit and a single combat knife, leaving her position to do field triage on soldiers who weren't even her unit. The colonel had called her back. She didn't come. She stayed with those Marines for 43 minutes while rounds kicked up dust around her, stabilizing hemorrhages, applying tourniquets, singing to a kid from Kentucky who was crying because he couldn't feel his legs anymore. 2 of them made it. The third one died anyway. His name was Marcus, and he was 19. When she came back inside the perimeter, Colonel Vance was waiting. The court-martial happened 6 weeks later in a canvas tent in Kandahar. Disobeying a direct order. Abandoning post. Reckless endangerment of unit assets. The words felt like they came from a different language. They'd been right, technically. She had disobeyed. She had left her post. But they'd been wrong about everything that mattered, and that was a thing she'd learned to live with by not thinking about it at all. The discharge was medical. They'd found a chronic ankle fracture from a rocket strike, conveniently overlooked during her entrance physical, and suddenly she had a reason to go home that didn't require a court-martial on her record. Honorable discharge. Benefits intact. Career over. She was 30 years old and had spent the last 12 of them in uniform, and suddenly she was wearing this blue scrub top instead, moving through hallways where nobody knew that her hands had held dying soldiers together, that she could intubate a patient in the dark using only touch, that she'd once performed a field thoracotomy with a knife made from aircraft wreckage and shrapnel, opening a man's chest cavity to manually massage a heart back to rhythm because there was no other choice, and waiting meant death. Now she checked blood pressures and changed bedpans. Now she was just a night shift nurse at a teaching hospital in Norfolk, Virginia, working the graveyard shift because that was when they asked the fewest questions and expected the fewest answers. She was rebuilding a civilian life one quiet shift at a time, the way you rebuild a building after a bomb, carefully, slowly, without expecting it to ever look quite right again. The call came through the unit radio at 2,237 hours, incoming trauma, training accident, 34-year-old male, Air Force, critical condition, ETA 8 minutes. Sarah was finishing a routine vital check on Mrs. Patterson in 3:04 when the announcement crackled through, and her hand stilled for exactly 2 seconds. An Air Force patient. That happened sometimes. This time, something in the tone of the paramedic's voice, the specific cadence, the slight echo of protocol she recognized, made her look up from the blood pressure cuff. The trauma bay exploded into motion 14 minutes later. Red lights, raised voices, the controlled chaos of a team that knew their choreography. Sarah moved to the supply station on instinct, gathering what would be needed: trauma shears, 4x4s, tourniquets, the kind of equipment her hands recognized before her mind did. A girl in scrubs, couldn't be more than 23, fresh out of nursing school, was frozen by the entrance, watching the paramedics offload the gurney. Sarah placed a hand on her shoulder, gentle but firm. "Breathe," she said quietly. "You're here to help. You help by staying calm." The girl nodded, and Sarah turned back to the bay just as the paramedics wheeled the patient through the automatic doors. Colonel Marcus Vance looked smaller than she remembered. That was the first shock. He was unconscious, his jaw slack, the left side of his face swollen purple from impact trauma. His breathing was shallow, rattling. The paramedics were calling out vitals, BP 94/58, dropping. Respiratory rate 8 and falling. GCS of 6. Lost consciousness at scene, no documented LOC, suspected head trauma, possible pneumothorax. Secured airway in the field. Sarah knew that voice. She knew it because it belonged to someone she hadn't heard in 7 years, and knowing it meant her past had just walked through the sliding doors of Sacred Heart Hospital like it had been invited. She steadied herself against the counter. Her hands didn't shake. They never shook in professional settings. That was discipline. That was survival. That was the thing she'd learned in Sangin and perfected in every shift since. Keep moving, keep breathing, keep your face blank and your hand steady, because the moment you fall apart is the moment someone else dies. The trauma team descended on the colonel like a coordinated machine. 2 resident physicians, the night shift attending, Dr. Richard Ashford, chief of surgery, who moved through the hospital like he owned the building's walls, and 4 nurses including Sarah. She slipped in on the right side of the gurney, her fingers already reaching for the trauma shears to cut away his flight suit, exposing the wound sites beneath. His left shoulder was discolored, swelling rapidly. Pneumothorax, confirmed. The ribs were probably broken. There was blood in his hair, a gash along his temple that would need 15, maybe 20 stitches. O2 sats dropping, someone called out. 88 and falling. Get me the needle, Dr. Ashford said, his voice crisp and commanding. 14-gauge angiocath. Decompression at the second intercostal space. Sarah was already reaching for the supplies. Her muscle memory was perfect. Hands that had held dying soldiers together knew exactly how to move. The colonel's chest was pale, his breathing panicked even in unconsciousness, shallow, irregular. The ventilator would help, but first they needed air out of the space around his lungs so they could reinflate. She had the needle ready, sterile, the insertion site already identified. This was the work. This was what she was good at. This was the thing they'd tried to court-martial out of her because she'd done it outside of permission. Who authorized you to prepare supplies? Dr. Ashford's voice cut across the bay like a scalpel. His eyes were on her, and his expression was exactly the thing she'd learned to read in a commanding officer's face, resentment wrapped in institutional authority. He was looking at her the way you look at someone who just revealed they're smarter than you assumed. Standard protocol, Doctor, Sarah said quietly, keeping her eyes on the colonel's chest. Trauma bay stabilization. Respiratory distress from possible tension pneumothorax. I'll direct this bay. You will follow instruction, not anticipate it. The room went quiet for exactly 2 seconds. Someone's foot shifted on the tile floor. The ventilator hissed its mechanical rhythm. The heart monitor beeped its urgent rhythm, 104. 107, 110. Sarah turned slightly, meeting his eyes for just a moment, one measured breath, holding it, then releasing. She placed the needle kit exactly where he could reach it, her movements precise and unhurried. Of course, Doctor. Dr. Ashford's jaw tightened. He hadn't expected compliance. He'd expected her to defend herself. The absence of defensiveness seemed to bother him more than the original challenge. He turned away sharply, needle in hand, moving toward the colonel's chest to perform the decompression himself, which was fine. That was his right. That was what rank was for. But as Sarah stepped back from the gurney to give him room, the colonel's hand moved slightly. Just a fraction. His fingers, which had been slack and lifeless moments before, flexed once. Twice. His eyes were still closed, still unconscious, but something in his body was responding to the presence in the room. His head turned maybe a half-inch toward the sound of her voice. And then, so quietly that only someone standing 3 feet away would have heard it, someone who was listening with the specific attention of someone who'd been listening for 7 years. The Colonel's lips moved. A single word, barely whispered, a name that wasn't his name and wasn't hers but belonged to both of them anyway. Guardian. That was the moment Sarah Chen understood that the past wasn't just walking through the sliding doors. It was asking for her help. The morning Dr. Ashford decided to break her, Sarah was checking the Colonel's vitals at 6:22 a.m., oxygen sat 94, heart rate stable, blood pressure climbing into normal range, when he materialized in the doorway with his white coat unbuttoned, his tailored shirt beneath it whiter than hospital standards required, and the Colonel's daughter standing beside him looking confused. Those numbers, Dr. Ashford said, not to Sarah but to the family, are substandard documentation. Sloppy. Incomplete. He gestured at her chart with 2 fingers, as though the papers themselves might contaminate him. This is what happens when you rely on night shift staff without proper supervision. No attention to detail. No rigor. Sarah's hands didn't move. She was still holding the blood pressure cuff, the Velcro strap dangling like a severed nerve. The Colonel's daughter glanced between them, searching for context, finding only hierarchy. I had respiratory check the arterial lines at 6:22, Sarah said. Her voice was flat. Professional. O2 sat improved by 0.7%. Vital stable for 8 hours. She didn't look at him. She didn't have to. Dr. Ashford smiled. The smile of a man who had already won the argument before anyone spoke. Your assessment is noted. And noted as deficient. He turned to the family. Colonel Vance is fortunate his primary physician maintains higher standards. He left the room moving like a man who had just delivered excellent news. The Colonel's daughter watched Sarah finish documenting. Neither of them spoke. But Sarah felt the weight of it, the implication settling like sediment. You are not competent. You cannot be trusted. You are less. By 8:13 a.m., a formal write-up had materialized on the unit bulletin board. Sarah found it while retrieving supplies from the locked cabinet, 3 pages stapled together in pale blue, the hospital's official complaint form, her name printed in 12-point Times New Roman. Dr. Richard Ashford, Chief of Surgery, was documenting repeated protocol violations in vital sign documentation, failure to follow chain-of-command reporting procedures, and negligence in patient monitoring. Not a single violation had actually occurred. The dates were wrong. The times were fabricated. The procedures cited didn't exist in Sacred Heart's manual. She read it once. Twice. Then she took it down and placed it in the break room trash, her movements precise, economical, the movements of someone performing a routine task, not the movements of someone whose hands wanted to shake. The break room at 10:38 a.m. was where the real work began. Sarah was pouring coffee, the hospital's acidic sludge, dark enough to stain teeth, the only warmth available at this hour, when 3 nurses from the morning shift sat down at the round table in the corner. They had been friendly 2 days ago. Now they fell silent. Completely. The kind of silence that has texture, that takes up space. Sarah turned. Coffee cup rising to her lips. That's when the exodus began. One nurse stood. Then another. The third waited, glancing sideways at Sarah as though asking permission to leave, then rose and followed. Their cups of coffee remained on the table, still steaming, abandoned mid-sip. The message was not subtle, contamination protocol in effect. Do not associate. A fourth nurse who had been standing near the refrigerator decided suddenly she needed supplies from another floor. A fifth pretended her phone had vibrated. Within 90 seconds, Sarah stood alone in the break room surrounded by cooling coffee cups like evidence markers. She sat down anyway. Pulled out the cheese sandwich her own hands had made at home at 2 a.m. before her shift started. Unwrapped it. Ate it in the silence of a room that had been carefully evacuated. The hiss of fluorescent lights hummed overhead like insects. Each chew was deliberate. Each swallow a refusal. The worst part wasn't the abandonment. The worst part was knowing Dr. Ashford had orchestrated it, that he'd had conversations in his office, made phone calls, exerted the kind of pressure that came with being chief of surgery, the kind of influence that accumulated when you held power long enough to weaponize it. By 2:06 p.m., with the morning shift ending and the night approaching, Sarah was standing in the medication room when Dr. Ashford appeared again, this time with 3 residents trailing behind him like remoras following a shark. He was dressed for rounds, his stethoscope draped around his neck, his presence making the fluorescent light seem dimmer somehow, as though he absorbed illumination. "Major Chen," he said, and the use of her rank was itself an insult, pronounced like an expired credential. "The colonel requires bedside assistance this afternoon. The residents are observing. I need you to handle toilet care and linen changes. They'll be watching your technique, such as it is. Bedpan duty. In front of witnesses." The assignment wasn't medical, it was ceremonial. It was a public declaration, this is what you are. This is your place. The residents shuffled their feet, uncomfortable. They knew it was wrong. They also knew their careers depended on maintaining vertical alignment. Sarah set down the medication drawer she'd been organizing. The bottles made a soft clicking sound, orderly, precise. She turned to face Dr. Ashford. Took one measured breath, in through her nose, out through her mouth, the kind of breath a person takes before stepping into combat, though no one in this room would recognize it as such. Their eyes met. His were waiting for tears, for stammering objections, for the brittle cracking of someone about to break. He had spent 48 hours arranging the infrastructure of her humiliation and now wanted to witness the collapse. What he found instead was absolutely still water. A depth he couldn't measure. "I've served under better men in worse places," Sarah said. Her voice was quiet. Not soft, quiet. The kind of quiet that makes people lean in to hear, which means they're moving into your space, which means you've already won control of the room. "And I'll handle the colonel's care the same way I handled it in the field." She didn't wait for his response. She didn't ask permission. She simply turned back to the medication drawer and resumed her work, her hands moving with the kind of muscle memory that doesn't require thought, that comes from having done similar work in tents under mortar fire, in aircraft with hydraulic fluid dripping from the fuselage, in places where incompetence meant people died. The residents followed Dr. Ashford out of the medication room. One of them, a young woman named Dr. Rodriguez, caught Sarah's eye for just a moment, half a second of recognition, maybe respect, definitely confusion. She'd seen something shift. She didn't understand it yet, but she'd seen it. By 11:22 p.m., with the night shift in full swing, Sarah was finishing documentation on the colonel's evening rounds when the overhead intercom made its usual 3-tone chime. A voice emerged, female, calm but with an edge underneath like a blade beneath velvet. "Code Blue, Trauma Bay 2. Incoming GSW, critical. ETA 6 minutes. Gunshot wound. Incoming critical." The night had just become operational. Sarah's hand stilled on the keyboard for exactly 1/2 second. That was all. The emergency department erupted. Night shift staff moving toward the trauma bay in organized urgency, moving like a military unit suddenly recognizing itself as military. Nurses pulling crash carts, gathering units of O negative, activating the trauma protocol that turned a civilian hospital into something resembling forward aid. Sarah was moving toward Trauma Bay 2 when she passed Drive Ashford in the hallway. He was buttoning his coat, the gesture of a man assuming command, though his eyes had already shifted, the instinctive dilation of pupils in a threat environment. For the first time, she saw him without his office around him, without institutional rank to obscure his actual competence. A surgeon, yes. But not a surgeon who worked in emergency medicine. Not a surgeon who made decisions under fire. The patient arrived at 11:28 p.m., a male in his mid-30s, clothing torn, a puncture wound 2 inches left of the midline, approximately 4th intercostal space, entrance wound maybe 3 mm diameter, exit wound not visible yet. The chest was already crackling with pneumothorax, the patient's breathing shallow, compensatory, a body in shock recognizing it was dying. "Move," Sarah heard herself say. Not request. Command. One word, stated as fact. The residents scattered like birds. Dr. Ashford was already at the bedside, reaching for the chest tube kit with fumbling hands. His jaw was tight. His breathing had accelerated. This was not his environment. This was crisis without protocol, decision-making without the buffer of hierarchical consultation. Sarah was already moving, 14-gauge needle, second intercostal space, midclavicular line, the anatomy pulling itself into relief in her mind like it was yesterday, like the desert heat wasn't even 3 years behind her but 3 seconds, like the screaming of helicopter rotors was still rotating overhead. She could smell it then, that smell that wasn't really a smell but a collection of smells that triggered the same synapse: copper, diesel fuel, dust so fine it coated your teeth, the sharp metallic odor of fear sweat, the chemical reek of antiseptic trying to mask something more primal. The trauma bay dissolved. The lights overhead became sun through sand-scratched windows. The rhythmic beeping of the monitor became mortar. Incoming. No, that was sniper fire from the northwest ridge. The village compound was taking fire from 3 positions and the wounded were coming in, Ahmed with his arm half severed, Martinez with a shrapnel wound the size of a fist in his thigh, and Ibrahim was already grey, already sliding toward death, and Sarah was working his chest with her hands while rounds punched through the compound walls and dust fell like ash, fell like the world was ending, fell like. The patient gasped. Oxygen returned. The monitor began its steady electronic song, rhythm restored from chaos, sinus rhythm climbing from the flat line like a man climbing out of darkness. Sarah blinked. The desert was gone. The compound was gone. The screaming had stopped. She was standing in a trauma bay at Sacred Heart Hospital in Norfolk, Virginia, at 11:34 p.m., with her hand still on a patient's chest cavity. The needle decompression had worked. The pneumothorax was releasing. O2 sat climbing, 72. 78, 84. The young man's eyes were fluttering, consciousness returning, the gift of oxygenated blood reaching his brain again. The residents were staring at her. Dr. Ashford had stepped back. His hands were empty. His face had gone a color that resembled old parchment. Get him to imaging, Sarah said, her voice the voice of someone who had done this before, someone who had done this 1,000 times, someone who had never stopped being what she was beneath the night shift scrubs and the carefully maintained invisibility. Tell them suspected hemothorax, possible cardiac involvement. Get type O blood ready. Start for liters normal saline, wide open. Move. The residents moved. Of course they moved. Of course they obeyed. And that's when the real nightmare began. The alarm cut through the ICU at 0306 hours like a blade finding a gap in armor. Sarah's hands moved before her mind caught up, muscle memory from Sangin flooding back in the space of a heartbeat. Colonel Vance's monitor showed the flat, terrible line of ventricular fibrillation, and the rhythm of his failing heart became silence. She was standing 3 feet from his bed when the alarm started. She moved closer. The ventilator wheezed its mechanical rhythm, indifferent to the crisis unfolding beneath it. Within 90 seconds, 10 doctors converged on the ICU ward, the night shift cardiologist, 2 residents, 3 hospitalists, the attending from the surgical floor, 2 nurses from the adjacent trauma unit pulled from their own stations, and Dr. Richard Ashford, chief of surgery, moving through the crowd with the practiced authority of a man who had never been questioned in his life. The air pressure in the room changed as he arrived. Sarah stepped back. The protocol was clear. She was the night shift nurse. These were the doctors. This was how Sacred Heart worked. Dr. Ashford's eyes swept across the monitors, across the colonel's face, across the arrest rhythm repeating its deadly pattern. His jaw tightened. He turned to the gathered physicians, his voice steady and measured, a voice that had made grown men comply with a single syllable. Check his advance directive. I want to see it before we proceed with compressions. One of the residents hesitated. Doctor, with respect, we don't usually. Check it. The resident moved. 30 seconds of searching. Nothing in the physical chart. Nothing in the bedside binder. Sarah watched Dr. Ashford reach into his coat pocket with the casual certainty of a man retrieving something he already knew was there. A single folded sheet of hospital paper, creased from carrying, emerged between his fingers. He unfolded it with ceremony. "Do not resuscitate," he read aloud, his eyes moving down the document with theatrical precision. Signed by Colonel Marcus Vance 3 hours ago. Witnessed by hospital staff. He looked up at the gathered doctors. "There's no question here. We let nature take its course." The words hung in the air like smoke. Sarah felt something cold move through her chest. 3 hours ago. She had been working this ward for 8 hours. She knew every signature on every form that came through the unit. She knew the colonel's handwriting, she'd seen his name on the court-martial documents that ended her career. This signature was wrong. The letters were too uniform, the pressure of the pen inconsistent, the flourish at the end of Vance executed by someone who had practiced it but never lived it. But more than that, she had spent the evening in the colonel's room. She had watched his daughter hold his hand through the evening shift change. He had spoken about his grandchildren. He had spoken about wanting to see spring. No one with that light in his eye signs a "do not resuscitate" at midnight. Dr. Ashford turned to the 10 doctors arrayed around the bed. "We've done our due diligence. The patient's wishes are clear. Everyone step back. Let him go with dignity." The room moved in response. Not with protest. Not with question. With obedience. That was what 10 years of hierarchy built on fear looked like, 10 professionals standing down because one man with institutional power had told them to. Sarah watched the cardiologist step away from the defibrillation pads. The resident lowered the crash cart. The nurses began the ritual of ceasing intervention, disconnecting, documenting, preparing for death. And Sarah Chen, night shift nurse at Sacred Heart Hospital in Norfolk, made a choice that would echo through the next 6 months and change the architecture of every life it touched. She didn't ask permission. She didn't debate. The moment Dr. Ashford turned toward the door, she moved to the bedside, her hand already reaching for the leather satchel she kept under the nursing station desk, the bag that still held instruments from Sangin, tools she had never unpacked, supplies she had never let go of because some part of her had always known that civilians didn't heal the way combat medics did. The combat knife came out like a dark promise. 8 inches of stainless steel, the handle worn smooth from her hands across 3 tours and 2 purple hearts. The weight of it was familiar. The grip was muscle memory. The 10 doctors watched her, frozen in that peculiar moment between action and response, between the world they knew and the world that was about to shatter. Sarah didn't hesitate. She didn't announce herself. She positioned her hands on the colonel's sternum, felt the landmarks under her fingers, the third intercostal space, the midclavicular line, the space where her hands had learned to keep people alive when there was nowhere left to run, and made the incision. The blade cut through skin and muscle with the efficiency of precision. The hiss of air escaping from the pleural space. The sudden exposure of the chest cavity, the ribs spreading as she worked, her movement steady and certain because pain was information and information was survival. She reached in, found the heart in her hand, felt the fibrillation under her palm, the useless, panicked flutter of a muscle giving up, and began the manual massage. Rhythm. Pressure. Release. Rhythm. Pressure. Release. Her hands moved like they had moved in a field surgical tent in Helmand Province, like they had moved when she was 26 years old and had learned that following orders was sometimes synonymous with watching people die. The colonel's heart responded to her touch. The monitor above registered the change, the flat line stuttered. Became rhythm. Not sinus rhythm yet, but rhythm. Life beginning to reassert itself against the darkness. She didn't count compressions. She counted purpose. The muscles of her forearm burned. Her surgical training from the Air Force Medical Corps, classified, unspoken, hidden under 8 years of deliberately casual night shift competence, poured out through her hands and into the colonel's chest. "Push epi," she said. Her voice had changed. It had dropped an octave. The tentativeness was gone. The careful deference had evaporated. What emerged was command, pure and unavoidable. 1 milligram for push. Now. One of the residents looked to Dr. Ashford. Dr. Ashford's face had gone white. I said now, petty officer. The medication went in. Sarah continued the massage, feeling the coronary vessels begin to perfuse, feeling the oxygenated blood reach the muscular tissue, feeling the impossible become possible under her hands. The monitor climbed, 65 beats per minute. 72, the oxygen saturation, plummeting, began its slow ascent, 68%. 75%. 82%. 88%. 92%. Sarah's hands maintained their rhythm, steady as surgical steel, precise as the girl she had been before the court-martial, before the discharge, before the night shift at Sacred Heart became her entire world. Defibrillator charged, she asked without turning. Already, yes. The resident's voice shook. Charge and deliver. 50 joules. The thud of electricity, the colonel's body jolting from the current. The monitor traced a moment of change, and then, sinus rhythm. Clear, steady, the electrical activity of a man's heart deciding to live. Sarah's hands stayed exactly where they were. The massage continued. The oxygen climbed to 94% and held. The colonel's blood pressure, decimated moments before, crept upward, 78/42. 82/45. The slow resurrection of a man who should have been dead but wasn't because someone with memory in her hands and defiance in her bones had refused to let him go. She finally released her hands from his chest and looked up. The 10 doctors had moved back from the doorway. Their faces registered what they were looking at, a night shift nurse performing an emergency thoracotomy at bedside with a combat knife, performing emergency cardiac massage with the practiced precision of someone who had done this before, someone for whom this was not unprecedented, someone who moved through medical crisis the way apex predators move through water. Dr. Ashford's mouth had opened. Closed. He looked at Sarah's hands, still covered in the colonel's blood, steady as stone, and then at her face, where she met his gaze without flinching, without apology, without the deference he had spent the last week grinding into her. That was when the fluorescent light seemed to flicker, and Sarah Chen, who had been trying so hard to be invisible, became impossibly, irreversibly visible. That was when the question everyone in that room had stopped asking suddenly demanded an answer: who the hell is this woman? The silence in the ICU lasted exactly 3 seconds. Then Dr. Ashford turned from the monitors where sinus rhythm had just bloomed across the screen like a second sunrise, and his face did something that Sarah had only glimpsed before, it folded inward. Fear. Pure, crystalline fear, watching the impossible become real before his eyes. He didn't move toward the patient. He didn't congratulate the team or call for stabilization labs. He walked out of that room with his phone already in his hand, and Sarah understood with the clarity that comes from 18 years of battlefield medicine, he was calling in the salvage operation for his own career. The first call came at 0317 hours. Sarah heard the click of his office door closing 3 rooms down, the thin walls of Sacred Heart yielding every word. His voice was different on the phone, not the theatrical precision he used with residents, but something leaner. Colder. Something that had survived its own winters. Richard Ashford calling the board president. I need to escalate a serious incident before the morning briefing. A pause. His fingers drumming on his desk, she could hear even that. A nurse performed an unauthorized thoracotomy at bedside using a personal weapon. Likely psychiatric episode. She's a security risk. The drumming stopped. He was listening. Then, yes. Tonight. 0306 hours. Another pause. I documented everything. Sarah moved methodically through the patient's post-resuscitation care, checking lines, confirming the 12-lead EKG patterns, noting the gradual climb of oxygen saturation, 72, 78, 84. Her hands did their work while her mind catalogued what was happening to her life 3 rooms away. Dr. Ashford had moved to his second call. She caught fragments through the ventilator's mechanical breathing, state licensing board, a situation, weapons on hospital grounds, precedent for removal. The third call was the one that made her pause with her hand on the four-port. His lawyer. She heard him laugh, actually laugh, the sound like ice breaking on a February river. I need documentation expedited. Performance review with timestamp, the medication incident from Tuesday, that near miss on the neuro floor. I don't care if it happened to another nurse. Just get the file from 2019. We're building a pattern. By 03:47 hours, the calls were done. The hospital was still dark except for the islands of light in the ICU and the distant glow of the night shift stations. Sarah finished her charting on Colonel Vance, who was sleeping now, his chest rising and falling with the ventilator's assistance, his heart steady in its newfound rhythm. She could have stayed longer. She didn't. Security found her in the break room at 0 for 2-3 hours. 2 officers, the older one named Reeves with kind eyes that apologized before his mouth did. They didn't make her walk. They were professionals. One carried a cardboard box. She recognized it immediately as the locker box from the staff storage area, the one with the broken corner she'd taped shut 3 months ago. Ms. Chen, you need to come with us. Not a question. Not a request. It wasn't a request. It was a command. The security office was smaller than she expected, painted that institutional beige that existed in every government building from Fort Bragg to the DMV. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead like tired cicadas. Dr. Ashford was already there, standing by the window with his arms crossed, his tie loosened, looking like a man who had been awake for too long with too much adrenaline. He didn't look at her directly. The termination notice was on the desk, 6 pages, printed and notarized with the hospital's seal embossed in gold. Dangerous and sanctioned procedures. Possession of a weapon on hospital grounds. The combat knife, which she had carried in that locker for 3 years, the same knife she had used to save a man's life because 10 doctors had decided his life wasn't worth the paperwork. You'll need to surrender your badge, Reeves said quietly. We'll need you to clear out your personal effects from the locker. You have 15 minutes. Sarah lifted the badge from around her neck, a plastic card on a blue lanyard, her face photographic and unsmiling, her name printed in Arial font. Chen, SRN. 3 years of night shifts. 3 years of building a life where she didn't have to think about Sangin or the faces of the Marines she couldn't save, the 3 she had disobeyed orders to carry out because leaving them meant they would die slowly, and she couldn't do that, she was built for something else. She handed the badge to Reeves. He took it like he was handling evidence. Perhaps he was. The locker was in the staff area, and Sarah moved through it with the same compartmentalized focus she had used in the trauma bay. Cracked ceramic mug from the 2019 nursing conference. A dying succulent that hadn't gotten enough light, its leaves papery and curled. A photograph in a plastic frame, small enough to fit in a palm, 12 people in desert uniforms, dust on their boots and the kind of smiles that only happen between people who have held each other's lives in their hands. 6 of them were dead now. The other 6 were scattered across the country, Tacoma, San Antonio, Jacksonville, Colorado Springs, places she had lost the language to reach them. She had tried twice, years ago. The silence had taught her not to try again. She put these things in the cardboard box. The knife was already gone, taken by security as evidence, and she found herself grateful for that small mercy. She didn't have to carry it out past the night shift nurses who would hear about this by shift change, who would already be making calculations about whether to leave when she sat down. The rain hit the parking lot in sheets at 0516 hours. She stood under the overhang for approximately 90 seconds, watching the downpour, then walked directly into it. The water was cold on her jacket and her boots, the same boots she had worn in Helmand Province, resoled twice, broken in by 1,000 miles of patrol, gripped the wet asphalt with the reliability of old friends. The bus stop was 3 blocks away. The nearest one, the 5:27 a.m. route that would take her through the harbor district and deposit her somewhere she had not yet decided. The shelter was broken on one side, the plexiglass smashed out sometime in the past month, so she sat on the bench with the cardboard box balanced on her knees and the rain coming sideways now, carrying the salt smell of the harbor and something else, engine oil, wet concrete, the particular grief of pre-dawn Norfolk. Her phone had 47 minutes of battery left. She had $347 in her checking account and a savings account with $14,200 in it, enough for perhaps for months if she was careful. She had a lease on an apartment that required 60 days' notice to break, and she was going to break that lease within 72 hours because she had learned in 3 years of civilian life that remaining near the place where you were destroyed was a form of slow torture. The mug in the box was from a conference on trauma nursing. She had earned a certificate. She had come home with notes in her handwriting about de-escalation and compassionate communication, and she had spent the past 3 years practicing these things while swallowing down the muscle memory of operations in the night. She could have thrown the mug in the trash. The rain would have carried it away. Instead, she held it. The photograph was harder. She lifted it out of the box carefully, the plastic frame wet now, the faces of her team blurred slightly behind the water. She could name every single person. Could remember what each one had ordered at the chow hall. Could close her eyes and hear their voices calling out coordinates and casualty counts and the kind of jokes you tell when you're 23 years old and invincible. Most of them weren't invincible. Sergeant Rodriguez, second from left. Dead outside Sangin, 2012. Corporal Wei, back row. Took shrapnel in 2011, lost the sight in his left eye, was medically discharged, and she had found him on Facebook 6 years later living in Portland, and she had clicked away without sending a message because what was there to say? Lieutenant Cole, front and center, his arm around Sarah's shoulders. He had been the one to write the report that got her court-martialed, the one who had to sign off because orders were orders and she had refused them. The last she heard, he was teaching Rotk at the University of Washington. She wondered if he ever thought about it. If he remembered that she had saved 3 people that day and lost her entire career for it. She held the photograph over the trash receptacle at the bus stop, a metal bin labeled with peeling font, already half full with someone else's wet garbage. Her hand was steady. The trembling wasn't fear. The trembling wasn't anything. She held the photograph, and the rain fell on the plastic frame, and she thought about Major Marcus Vance in the ICU, his heart beating because she had disobeyed 10 doctors the way she had once disobeyed orders to save 3 Marines. One of those Marines had survived for exactly 6 months post-discharge. Then the PTSD had found him in a stateside apartment in Leshan and had whispered things he couldn't unhear, and his mother had called the unit to tell them he wasn't coming to the reunion. The other 2 had made it. She thought about them sometimes, wondered if they ever thought of her. The photograph was shaking now, or her hands were, or both. She didn't throw it. She put it back in the box and closed her eyes against the rain, and for the first time in 3 years, she let herself ask the question she had been trained not to ask. Maybe they were right. Maybe Ashford was right. Maybe civilian life was where she belonged, and maybe the only thing she had accomplished by disobeying orders was creating a pattern, proving that she couldn't follow the rules, that she was fundamentally unsafe. The bench was wet under her. The cardboard box was beginning to soften. Her badge was insecurity evidence. Her job was gone. Her apartment lease was about to become a problem. She had $347 and a dying plant and a coffee mug and photographs of the dead. And then she heard it. Not a vehicle. Not an engine. Something older than that. Something that belonged to a part of her life that she thought she had successfully buried in 3 years of civilian routine. The sound of rotors, distant but getting closer, moving against the pre-dawn sky toward Norfolk like something that had been called. She didn't move. She didn't even open her eyes. But her hands went very still, and her breathing slowed to the pattern she had learned in Kandahar, and some part of her that had been in hibernation for 36 months whispered, "Here they come." The rotor wash hit the parking lot at 08 for 7 hours, and Sarah's hands went still on the cardboard box balanced across her knees. She knew that sound. UH-60M Black Hawk, Army Aviation, the distinctive thump-thump-thump of a bird that had come to collect something. Or someone. The rain stopped for exactly 2 seconds as the helicopter descended towards Sacred Heart's roof, and that silence, that impossible pause in the weather itself, told her everything. They were here for her. She didn't stand. Didn't move. The box held a cracked mug from 2015, a succulent that would be dead by Tuesday, and a photograph of her combat medic team at Sangin. 5 faces. 2 of them gone. 3 scattered to lives she would never know. The photo was creased from being folded and unfolded for 3 years, the kind of damage that came from being carried in a breast pocket through every shift, every break room moment, every time someone asked what she had done before nursing. The hospital's glass doors slid open and 2 figures emerged. One was a woman in an Air Force dress uniform, her rank insignia catching the morning light like a warning. General Patricia Hawthorne, Commander of Air Medical Operations. The kind of officer who didn't appear in person unless something had shifted beneath the surface of the world. Behind her walked a man in a suit, federal credentials hanging from his neck like a declaration. FBI. The general's eyes found Sarah across the parking lot and locked there, steady as a laser sight. The second figure was a nurse, Rodriguez, from the ICU night shift. His face was pale. He kept glancing back at the hospital entrance as if Dr. Ashford might emerge at any moment and fire him too for standing here. Major Chen. The general's voice carried across the rain-slicked asphalt without raising. Command voice. The kind that made people's spines straighten involuntarily. I'm going to need you to stand up. Sarah stood. The box didn't fall. My name is General Patricia Hawthorne. I commanded Air Force Combat Rescue for 12 years. You served under my direct authority for 6 of those years. The general walked closer, boots clicking against the wet concrete. I watched your rescue at Sangin from a tactical operations center 3,000 miles away. I listened to your radio traffic as you went back into that compound twice after your first extraction. I signed the commendation for your Silver Star personally. The cardboard box trembled. Sarah's hand steadied it. What I did not do, the general continued, was court-martial you. Colonel Marcus Vance did that. Because you disobeyed his direct order to let 3 Marines die rather than risk your own life. You thought that signature ended your career. The general stopped 3 feet away. It didn't. It only paused it. Inside Sacred Heart, the monitors were still beeping. Dr. Ashford was still breathing. But somewhere in the administrative offices, someone was frantically scrolling through email archives, searching for the fabricated records they had created, realizing with the sick certainty of a person watching their own disaster unfold that the game had changed. At 0715 this morning, the general said, I received a phone call from the FBI's counterintelligence division asking why a United States Air Force officer received a falsified do not resuscitate order from a civilian physician. That same physician then proceeded to terminate the enlisted medical provider, you, for preventing that officer's death. I was asked to comment on live national television. She paused. I accepted. Rodriguez's phone buzzed. He pulled it out and his face drained of color. General, the news station just went live with your press conference. 3 million viewers. The general didn't look away from Sarah. Dr. Ashford called into the broadcast to defend his actions. To describe you as a disturbed former employee with delusions of medical expertise. That was his mistake. She gestured at the FBI agent. Agent Morrison, would you tell Major Chen what you found on Dr. Ashford's computer? The agent stepped forward, and Sarah caught the faint smell of coffee and new leather from his jacket. 13 fabricated incident reports dating back for months. Backdated complaints signed by residents who testified they never wrote them. A spreadsheet tracking your schedule to coordinate staff exclusions. And a draft email to your state licensing board describing you as, quote, a danger to patients and a security risk due to untreated PTSD, unquote. Sent this morning at 0604 hours. 3 minutes before you were escorted from the building. Sarah's breath didn't catch. Her hands didn't shake. But something inside her, something that had been locked down since Sangin, since the moment Vance's gavel came down, felt the chains coming loose. "There's more," Rodriguez said, his voice trembling. "They're reading Colonel Vance's medical file on live television right now. His daughter is on camera." The general turned to face the hospital entrance. Sarah followed her gaze. Through the glass doors, visible on the wall-mounted television in the ER waiting room, was a young woman in her 20s, holding a folder with shaking hands. "This is my father's actual advance directive," the woman said on the broadcast, her voice breaking. "Signed 6 months ago. He wanted all measures taken to preserve his life. He wanted to be resuscitated. He wanted to live." She held up a second document. "This is what Dr. Ashford showed the medical team at 0306 hours. A fabrication. A forgery. A document that never existed until someone created it at 0258 hours on the morning my father's heart stopped." The silence in the parking lot stretched for 8 seconds. Even the rain seemed to pause. The hospital's board issued a statement at 0828 hours, the FBI agent said quietly. 10 doctors are suspended pending investigation for failing to perform emergency resuscitation on a patient in cardiac arrest. Dr. Richard Ashford has been terminated for falsifying medical documents, obstructing medical care, and weaponizing hospital policy to obstruct a patient's treatment and terminate a medical provider. Additionally, we are coordinating with state medical boards in 4 jurisdictions to initiate license revocation proceedings. Sarah lowered the cardboard box to the ground. She didn't open it. Didn't look inside at the photograph of her team, half of them gone, the other half scattered. She just stood there, the faded unit patch sewn inside her jacket lining feeling suddenly like it was glowing against her ribs. "Colonel Vance is being transferred to the Walter Reed Medical Center's Veteran Wing," the general said. "With a full security detail. The FBI is investigating Dr. Ashford's potential coordination with hospital administration to obstruct medical care. We suspect this goes deeper than one physician." She extended her hand. "But Sacred Heart called this morning. They want to offer you something." The FBI agent handed Sarah a folder. Inside was a letter on hospital letterhead dated that morning. Sacred Heart CEO, in 17 words, offered her the position of Director of Trauma Services. Effective immediately. Full authority over emergency protocols. Salary, $148,000 annually. Plus the authority to investigate and reform the policies Dr. Ashford had weaponized. Sarah didn't cry. Didn't smile. Didn't do anything except breathe, steady and measured, the way she had learned in Kandahar when chaos was trying to kill you and the only thing standing between death and survival was your refusal to break. "Welcome home, Major," the general said. 6 months later, Sarah stood in Sacred Heart's new trauma and surgical intensive care unit, reviewing protocols at 2,214 hours. The unit had been completely redesigned. New monitors. New equipment. A trauma bay that could support simultaneous resuscitations. And on the wall, a plaque, the Chen Protocol, Emergency Medicine Standards. Her name on it. Her work. Her authority codified into policy. Dr. Richard Ashford, at that same moment, was arranging supplemental insurance policies at a folding table outside a strip mall urgent care in Tucson, Arizona. The name tag on his polo shirt read, Steve. His medical license had been revoked in 4 states. The remainder suspended pending federal investigation. When former colleagues walked past the table, he flinched. Looked away. The kind of man who had once controlled rooms now hoping no one would recognize him. Colonel Marcus Vance sat in a wheelchair in Sacred Heart's new Veterans Care Wing at 0814 hours, watching the morning shift arrive. His legs would never work again, the cardiac arrest had caused neurological damage that surgery couldn't repair, but his mind was intact. His eyes were sharp. Every morning at 0814, Sarah made rounds in the Veterans Wing, checking vitals on the former service members the hospital had begun prioritizing for pro bono care. When she reached Vance's room, he was always waiting. She stopped at his bedside and pulled up his vitals on the tablet. Blood pressure stable. Heart rate regular. Oxygen saturation 98%. All the numbers a nurse learns to read like language. "Morning, Major," Vance said quietly. She looked at him, the man whose signature had ended her Air Force career, now watching her begin her second one, and for the first time in 6 months, she smiled. Not a big smile. A nurse's smile. The kind that comes from knowing someone is going to live. "Morning, sir," she said. He brought his right hand up slowly and saluted her. Palm out. The gesture that meant respect. Acknowledgement. An apology that had taken 6 months and a cardiac arrest and the general of the entire United States Air Force calling into live national television to finally become true. Sarah touched her own hand to her temple and saluted back. That afternoon, the hospital board announced additional reforms. A veterans integration program. Mandatory cultural competency training for all physicians. New protocols for do not resuscitate orders requiring patient signature verification. And most importantly, any physician attempting to circumvent emergency care protocols would face immediate termination and state board review. Sarah Chen would oversee implementation. She was offered chief of medicine 3 times. She declined 3 times. The morning shift needed a night shift charge nurse who understood trauma. The veterans wing needed someone who remembered what it meant to serve. The patients arriving in cardiac arrest needed someone whose hands had held a human heart in her own palms and refused to let it stop beating. The trembling wasn't fear. It was restraint. For 3 years she had restrained the part of herself that was Major Sarah Chen, Air Force Combat Rescue, Silver Star, and 2 Bronze Stars with Valor. She had locked that identity away in a jacket lining and carried it through 12-hour shifts as if it was someone else's burden. But restraint has an expiration date. At some point the pressure builds so high that something has to give. And when it does, when that mask finally cracks, the world learns why you were hiding in the first place. Sarah walked through Sacred Heart's corridors at night the way she always had. Invisible. Efficient. Quiet. But now when she passed the doctor's stations, the residents stood up. When she entered a trauma bay, the nurses moved to her without being asked. When a patient coded, the entire ICU waited for her decision. She had rebuilt her identity not by forgetting who she was, but by refusing to let anyone else define her worth. The uniform was gone. The rank was whispered now, not screamed. But the work was exactly the same. Saving lives. Holding the line between chaos and order. Refusing to let death win. And every morning at 0814, a man in a wheelchair who had once ended her career watched her begin a new one, understanding finally that redemption doesn't come from forgetting the past. It comes from refusing to let it own the future. True class is what you do when the lights go out. If you've ever been judged by someone who didn't know your story, if you've ever had to prove your worth to people who thought they already knew your limits, subscribe. Hit the notification bell. And in the comments, tell me, what would you have done if the man who destroyed your career was the same man you had to save?